For 3,000 years, the eastern Mediterranean had been rising. Empires stretched across continents, trade networks linked distant shores. Bronze flowed from Cyprus, tin came from as far as Afghanistan. Grain moved in vast quantities from Egypt to the Aegean. Scribes recorded transactions in multiple languages. Diplomatic letters crossed borders in cuneiform. The palace economies of the Late Bronze Age represented the first truly international system, a web of interdependence that spanned from Mesopotamia to the Atlantic. And then, in the span of a single human lifetime, it collapsed. Between 1200 and 1150 BCE, nearly every major city in the eastern Mediterranean was destroyed. Palaces burned, trade routes went silent, writing systems were abandoned. Population centers that had stood for centuries were reduced to ash and ruin. The catastrophe was so complete that in Greece, the very knowledge of literacy vanished for 400 years. Historians call this the Bronze Age collapse. It remains one of the most profound mysteries in the human record. We can see what happened. The archaeological evidence is unmistakable. But the question of why continues to generate debate. No single explanation accounts for the speed, the scale, or the simultaneity of the destruction. What we are confronting is not the fall of one civilization, but the disintegration of an entire world system. To understand the collapse, we must first understand what was lost. The Late Bronze Age was not a collection of isolated kingdoms. It was an interconnected order, bound together by trade, diplomacy, and mutual dependence. Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Mycenae in Greece, the kingdoms of the Levant, Cyprus, and Mesopotamia functioned as a coherent network. Royal correspondence flowed between courts, marriages were arranged to secure alliances, gifts moved across borders as symbols of friendship and obligation. One archive of clay tablets discovered at Tel el-Amarna in Egypt preserves this world in remarkable detail. The Amarna letters contain diplomatic correspondence between the Egyptian pharaohs and the rulers of Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, and the Hittite Empire. The language of these letters reveals a system of peers. The great kings addressed one another as brothers. They negotiated trade agreements. They requested specific goods, gold, horses, chariots, luxury items. They complained when gifts were delayed or deemed insufficient. This was not mere politeness, it was structural. The palace economies of the Bronze Age depended on access to resources distributed unevenly across geography. Egypt had grain and gold, but lacked timber and metals. Anatolia controlled copper. Cyprus produced bronze in industrial quantities. The Levant sat at the crossroads of overland trade routes. No single kingdom possessed everything it needed. Cooperation was necessity. Beneath this diplomatic layer, a vast mercantile network operated. Shipwrecks discovered off the coast of Turkey provide a snapshot of this trade. The Uluburun wreck, dated to the 14th century BCE, carried a cargo that spanned the known world. 10 tons of copper ingots from Cyprus, 1 ton of tin, likely from Central Asia, ebony from Africa, ivory from Syria, glass ingots, pottery, jewelry, weapons, and raw materials from a dozen different regions. A single vessel carried the wealth of an entire economic system. The scale of production was staggering. At Timna, in the Negev desert, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of massive copper smelting operations. The site produced tens of thousands of tons of copper over several centuries. This was not small-scale craft production, it was industrial output, coordinated across regions, directed toward supplying an international market. The cities themselves reflected this wealth. Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos in Greece were dominated by fortified palaces surrounded by cyclopean walls, massive stones fitted together without mortar, so large that later Greeks believed they had been built by giants. In Anatolia, The Hittite capital of Hattusa sprawled across a vast plateau, protected by monumental gates adorned with stone lions and sphinxes. Ugarit, on the Syrian coast, thrived as a cosmopolitan port, its archives preserving texts in 8 different languages and 5 writing systems. These were not primitive societies, they possessed sophisticated bureaucracies. Palace scribes tracked grain stores, livestock, textile production, and labor assignments. Linear B tablets from Mycenae in Greece record inventories in astonishing detail. Hundreds of workers organized by occupation, rations distributed by the day, flocks numbered in the thousands. The system depended on writing, on measurement, on administrative oversight. But this complexity carried a vulnerability. The late Bronze Age palace economies were not resilient, they were fragile, highly centralized, dependent on long-distance trade, and reliant on stable political conditions. The entire structure rested on a foundation of order. Around 1200 BCE, that disruption arrived. Any disruption to one part of the network risked cascading through the whole. Around 1200 BCE, that disruption arrived. The first signs appear in the Hittite archives. In the final years of the 13th century, the Hittite king writes urgently to the governor of Ugarit, demanding grain shipments. The tone is desperate. Famine has struck Anatolia. The capital is running out of food. Another letter orders the immediate dispatch of ships to collect grain from ports along the coast. The message is clear. The Hittite heartland is failing. At the same time, references to raiders appear. A letter from the king of Alasya, likely Cyprus, warns of enemy ships attacking coastal settlements. The violence is not isolated. It is systematic. Multiple kingdoms report attacks. Ugarit sends frantic requests for military aid. The response never comes. In the ruins of Ugarit itself, archaeologists found a final letter, never sent. It was still sitting in the oven, waiting to be baked into permanent form when the city was destroyed. The message describes enemy ships offshore and towns already in flames. The author pleads for help. The tablet was buried under ash and rubble. Ugarit burned. It was never rebuilt. Across the eastern Mediterranean, the pattern repeats. Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes, nearly every major Mycenaean palace was destroyed by fire. In Anatolia, Hattusa was abandoned. The Hittite Empire, which had ruled Anatolia for 5 centuries, vanished from history. Along the Levantine coast, city after city fell. Hazor, Megiddo, Lachish, all major urban centers, all reduced to ruins within a narrow window of time. Egypt survived, but barely. The inscriptions of Pharaoh Ramesses III describe waves of invaders arriving by land and sea. He calls them the Sea Peoples, a coalition of groups with names recorded in Egyptian hieroglyphs. Peliset, Cheker, Shekelesh, Denyen. Some of these names may correspond to later populations. The Peliset are often identified with the Philistines, but their origins remain unclear. Ramesses claims to have defeated them in a great battle. The temple reliefs at Medinet Habu depict Egyptian forces repelling invaders on land and destroying their ships at sea. Egypt held, but the cost was immense. The kingdom's power was broken. The age of Egyptian dominance in the Levant ended. The empire contracted inward and never fully recovered. For decades, the Sea Peoples were considered the primary cause of the Bronze Age collapse. The narrative was straightforward. Mysterious invaders swept through the eastern Mediterranean, destroying everything in their path. But this explanation raises more questions than it answers. Who were they? Where did they come from? How did scattered groups of raiders bring down empires that commanded armies numbering in the tens of thousands?
More recent scholarship has shifted away from monocausal explanations. The collapse was not the result of a single event. It was the convergence of multiple pressures, each amplifying the others, pushing an already strained system past the breaking point.
One factor was environmental. Paleoclimate studies using sediment cores, tree rings, and pollen analysis reveal a significant climatic shift around 1200 BCE. The eastern Mediterranean entered a prolonged drought. Rainfall decreased, rivers shrank, agricultural yields declined. For societies dependent on consistent harvests to feed dense populations and supply armies, this was catastrophic. Famine does not merely weaken states, it destabilizes them. Hungry populations migrate, governments lose legitimacy, armies disband when they cannot be fed. The Hittite grain requests suggest that even before the collapse, the system was struggling to manage resource distribution. A second factor was systemic fragility. The palace economies were not designed to withstand disruption. They relied on centralized control, on scribes recording every transaction, on administrators directing labor and distributing rations. When palaces burned, the entire administrative apparatus vanished. Without records, there was no way to organize production. Without rations, workers dispersed. The system could not reboot. It simply stopped. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. In the centuries following the collapse, populations did not disappear, they dispersed. Many regions saw a shift from centralized urban settlements to smaller, scattered villages. People abandoned the palaces and returned to subsistence farming. Trade networks contracted. Pottery styles became localized. The international economy fractured into isolated regional systems. In Greece, this transformation was particularly severe. The Mycenaean palaces were abandoned. Linear B script, used exclusively for palace administration, was forgotten. Writing would not return to Greece until the 8th century BCE, when the Greeks adopted the Phoenician alphabet. For 400 years, Greece entered what scholars call the Dark Age, not because it was a time of barbarism, but because it left almost no written record. Yet even in this period of collapse, some threads of continuity persisted. Not every region suffered equally. While the great palace centers fell, smaller settlements in more remote areas survived. In Cyprus, the transition was less catastrophic. Cities were damaged, but they rebuilt. Populations shifted, but they did not vanish. The island remained a hub of copper production, though on a reduced scale. Similarly, Assyria in northern Mesopotamia weathered the collapse relatively intact. The Assyrian heartland was less dependent on maritime trade and benefited from a more militarized political structure. While other kingdoms fragmented, Assyria contracted but endured. Within a few centuries, it would emerge as the dominant power of the Iron Age. The survival of these regions highlights an important point. The Bronze Age collapse was not universal. It was concentrated in areas most dependent on the palace economy model and most exposed to the disruptions of trade, climate, and conflict. The collapse was not the end of civilization, it was the end of a particular form of civilization. One of the most telling aspects of the collapse is what followed. The Eastern Mediterranean did not return to the organizational model of the late Bronze Age. The palace economies were not rebuilt. Instead, new forms of social and political organization emerged. In the Levant, smaller city-states arose, less centralized and more adaptable. Phoenician traders replaced the palace-controlled trade networks, operating as independent merchants rather than state agents. In Greece, the collapse gave way to the formation of the polis, the independent city-state that would define classical Greek civilization. The Dark Age was not merely a time of loss, it was a period of reorganization during which new political structures, new economic systems, and new cultural identities took shape.
Iron replaced bronze as the dominant metal. This shift had profound consequences. Bronze production required access to tin, a rare resource controlled by a few suppliers. Iron ore, by contrast, was widely available. The technology of iron smelting spread rapidly. By the early 1st millennium BCE, iron tools and weapons were common across the Mediterranean and Near East. The monopolies that had sustained the Bronze Age palace economies dissolved. The collapse also marked a shift in military organization. The chariot warfare that had dominated Bronze Age battlefields declined. Chariots were expensive, requiring skilled craftsmen, trained horses, and substantial logistical support. They were weapons of centralized states. As those states fell, infantry became the dominant force. The hoplite phalanx of classical Greece, the massed spear formations of later Near Eastern armies, these were the military innovations of societies that could no longer sustain chariot corps. The transformation was not immediate. Societies do not reorganize overnight. But by the end of the Dark Age, the Mediterranean world had fundamentally changed. The palace economies were gone. In their place arose a more diverse, more decentralized, and in some ways more dynamic set of cultures. The Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Israelites, the Assyrians, each emerged from the ruins of the Bronze Age, carrying fragments of the old world into something new.
This raises a deeper question. Was the Bronze Age collapse a catastrophe or a transition? For those who lived through it, the answer is unambiguous. Cities burned, populations were displaced, knowledge was lost. The collapse brought immense suffering. But from the long view of history, the picture is more complex. The collapse destroyed a system that, while impressive, was also brittle. It cleared space for experimentation, for new forms of organization, for innovations that the rigid palace economies might never have allowed. There is a lesson embedded in the Bronze Age collapse. Complexity is not the same as resilience. The late Bronze Age world was highly complex, with sophisticated trade networks, bureaucratic administration, and monumental architecture. But that complexity made it vulnerable. When the system was stressed, it could not adapt. It broke. Modern parallels are difficult to ignore. Our own world is built on global supply chains, interconnected financial systems, and technologies that require constant maintenance. Like the Bronze Age palace economies, we depend on stability. Disruptions in one region cascade through the network. Climate change, resource scarcity, geopolitical conflict, these pressures are not unfamiliar. The question is whether our systems are more resilient than theirs or simply more elaborate. The Bronze Age collapse reminds us that no system, no matter how advanced, is guaranteed continuity. Civilizations do not progress in a straight line. They rise, they stabilize, and under sufficient pressure, they fail. What survives is not always the most powerful, but the most adaptable. The Mediterranean eventually recovered. New civilizations rose. The Iron Age brought its own achievements, its own empires, its own innovations. But the world that emerged was not a restoration of what had been lost. It was something different, shaped by the memory of collapse and the necessity of rebuilding.
In the end, the Bronze Age collapse was both an ending and a beginning. It marked the death of the first international order and the birth of the world that would follow. The palaces fell, the networks dissolved, but humanity did not. In the ruins, new societies took root. The collapse was not the end of history. It was a hinge, a moment when the old world gave way to forces it could not contain, and the future emerged from the ashes of what had been. The sea peoples, the droughts, the internal weaknesses, these were not separate causes. They were threads in a single unraveling. The collapse teaches us that systems built on integration and interdependence carry within them the seeds of their own fragility. When the center fails, the periphery cannot hold, and when the collapse comes, it comes quickly. 1200 BCE was not merely a date, it was a threshold. On one side stood the palace civilizations of the Bronze Age, confident in their permanence. On the other lay darkness, uncertainty, and the slow, painful work of reconstruction. What the people of that time could not see, and what we can only grasp in retrospect, is that collapse is not an aberration. It is a feature of complex systems. It is the price of integration, the shadow that follows every age of connection. The question is not whether such collapses can happen. History answers that clearly. The question is whether we can learn from them, whether we can build systems that bend without breaking, whether we can recognize the warning signs before the cities begin to burn. The Bronze Age did not end because humanity failed. It ended because the world it built could not sustain the weight of its own ambitions. That is a pattern worth remembering.